Whether you're into unsolved mysteries, solved mysteries, or creating your own mysteries, Amazon Music's got millions of podcast episodes waiting. Just download the Amazon Music app and start listening to your favorite podcasts ad-free, included with Prime.
Today's episode is brought to you by thecollector.com. If you're into mind-blowing dives into ancient history, philosophy, killer art breakdowns, or even epic travel spots with a cultural twist, visit thecollector.com. Stories to teach, inform, and inspire. Hey listeners, this is Peter, and welcome back to the History Shorts podcast conversation series, where I speak with the leading voices in history today. For past episodes, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com/conversations and look for new episodes every Friday. Don't forget to check out our regularly scheduled daily shorts wherever you get your podcasts. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome back the Pulitzer Prize winning historian Edward J. Larson, whose acclaimed works have illuminated pivotal moments in American history. Today, we'll be diving deep into his newest release, Declaring Independence: Why 1776 Matters. This thought-provoking book revisits the revolutionary year of 1776, not just as the birth of a nation, but as a crucible of ideas that forged the foundational principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance. Through fresh insights and vivid storytelling, Dr. Larson examines how the events of that fateful year, from the drafting of the Declaration of Independence to the battles and debates that defined it, continue to resonate amid today's global challenges to democracy and freedom.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Edward, welcome back to the History Shorts podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
So what was the impetus for this book? We started talking about it and I realized I didn't click record. So what started this idea and what made this book come to fruition?
I was thinking about the coming of the 250th anniversary. If it was a few years coming, but it was coming. And I was thinking about books to assign my classes or to deal with that. And it dawned on me, and I really hadn't thought of the question before. And then I did some research to confirm that nobody had ever really tried to write a history of just that year. The history that focused on why that year mattered, an intellectual history, as it were, a history of the ideas that motivated that year. Because everybody was saying, 1776, year that changed America. And when I looked at, all we really had were about the year were books about the military history during that year. They weren't about the ideas. Later on, years later, in a famous exchange, former President John Adams wrote to former President Thomas Jefferson. They'd become close again. And he wrote, in typical John Adams style, he was always very introspective, and he wrote, "What was the revolution?" And then he answers his own question, of course. John Adams always did. It wasn't the war. The war was merely a consequence or an effect of the revolution. The revolutions were in the minds of the American people, and it was done by 1776. And thinking about that, I wanted to look at, what happened in that year that changed not only America, but actually changed the world. If you look at the people back that time, the people writing back at that time, people like Thomas Paine in Common Sense, he said, describe this as a monumental, as something new under the sun, as a total transformation, as a something that would matter forever. And that simply can't just be the independence of a country, because new countries splinter off of old countries all the time. They always have. It's just the way things are. Countries split apart, they're new countries, but they were dictating, and it didn't matter whether you were Thomas Jefferson or or George Washington or Thomas Paine, Benjamin Rush. They were all recognizing that this was something profoundly different than one colonial people splitting off from the mother country.
Your book actually says and starts off with this idea that virtually no one initially in the colonies was advocating for this independence. But by the year's end, you have or every patriot's lips, I think I quote. What do you identify as the key turning point in this shift, and which one surprised you the most in your research?
Before 1776, because my research, my looking, my thinking, my reflecting does make the year consequential. And it's not consequential because what happens on the battlefield. If anything, the year was a military disaster for the Patriots. They lost New York. They were beat all over the place. Washington was in full retreat until the very end. And then there was a sort of a minor but inspirational victory at Trenton. But what changed was when that year began, virtually none of the patriots openly advocated independence, and most of them didn't really want it. What they were seeking, and you could see it in the petitions of the previous year. You could see it in the such as the Olive Branch petition. What the Americans were seeking were the rights that they believed they had, the basic freedoms, the basic rights of British subjects of the king. And they thought Parliament had taken those away from them, that they had had them earlier. And so they wanted these traditional rights under the king. So Virginia would be like Scotland. It would have the rights under the king. And even in 1775, there'd been the Battle of Lexington and Concord. There'd been the Battle of Bunker Hill. There was the formation of the American Army. Washington was appointed, but in all those documents, they said, we are seeking our rights as English subjects, as subjects of the king. And their criticisms were always against Parliament. What happened during 1776, by the end of it, as you put it on everybody's lips, independence. It's not that they still didn't want liberty. They wanted the same rights they were fighting for before. But what they gave up was the idea that they could ever get it under a monarch. And in particular, they couldn't get it under the British monarch. But they couldn't get it under any monarch. That the very notion of monarchy was blown apart. And their goal became representative government, republics. And that required independence because they could no longer be under the king. And so their grievances pivoted, where before in the Olive Branch petition, in the declaration for calling up arms, creating an American or a patriot army, in the siege of Boston, they were always fighting to get the king to recognize their rights as British subjects. And they gave up on that as ever possible. That's what they viewed as this great goal, this shining opportunity, this transformational thing, because nowhere in the world was there truly a republic. Back in Poland, they elected the king, or in Venice, they called it the Republic of Venice, and they elected the Doge. But those were still authoritarian leaders. The Doge would serve for life. They didn't have the idea of republican governments, of elected governments, of representative governments, and they didn't have written constitutions. And over the course of that year, they became convinced that is what they're speaking. Now, there's certainly some suggestion that Benjamin Franklin might have already been there. But he was tactful, of course, and pragmatic and didn't speak about it. But you have Adams, you have Jefferson, you have all these people affirming that at the beginning of the year that they were not fighting for independence. And by obviously the Continental Congress declares independence in July, and more people came over after that. It was a series of ideas. presented by people like John Adams in his Thoughts on Government, a most important pamphlet he ever wrote that came out in May of 1776. Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which came out in January of the year. The writings and talks of people like George Mason, obviously Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, and then ongoing throughout later in the year, some of the people who were somewhat slower to come around, like Robert Morris, also would come around and decide, no, our only future lies with independence. And so during that year, virtually every state repudiated their colonial charter, which had been issued to them by the king, that put them either directly under the king or under a proprietor. In England, it was under the king, like the Penn family, or the family that governed Maryland, the Calverts, and wrote their own written constitution, the first written constitutions ever written, which established republican governments under legislative leadership in all the new states, as they now call themselves. They were now states. They were no longer colonies. And though it was a series of actions, ideas, fostering actions, battles, and declarations, which in turn fostered further ideals. So it was an interplay of a year. And what I try to capture in the book is that interplay of thought and deed that transformed not only America, but eventually the world.
And kind of going along with that, the subtitle of the book is awesome. Why 1776 Matters. In your view, what is the single most misunderstood or maybe overlooked way in which 1776 continues to matter today?
I don't know if it's overlooked, but it's the ideas. Ideas. I mean, you come from a formerly communist country, and the ideas that were expressed by like Valenza, the other leaders there in Poland, those ideas changed Poland. And the ideas that an authoritarian king could never be a foundation of individual liberty. The idea that the people should rule. The North Carolina, and you could do this with all the states, but North Carolina Constitution begins, written in 1776, begins where before, of course, sovereignty lied in the king. Begins with the affirmation that the people are sovereign. And that idea that the people are sovereign and the people reign and they rule through their elected representatives. That idea was electric. And that's the idea that's spread throughout the world. And was, as Adams would explain in his Thoughts in Government pamphlet, and Thomas Paine as well in Common Sense, which is the most widely read pamphlet of percentage-wise, probably all of American history, but certainly of that time, explained that the goal of government, borrowing, of course, on other ideas that came out of people like John Locke and Rousseau, that the goal of government is to protect and promote the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of the people. That was a term used often back then. What's the goal of government? It's to promote as much as possible the happiness of the people. And by happiness, they didn't mean sort of going off and partying. They meant a deeper sense of satisfaction, of value, of self-identity, developing. And so if that's the goal, they would explain, the only way to get to that goal, if the happiness of the people, or the greatest number of people, is the goal, they word it different ways. Only a republican can lead it. Only a government where the people, the truly representative government that represents the people, because you're never going to get it from an authoritarian leader, whether it be an authoritarian leader in communist Russia or whether it was an authoritarian leader in the Vatican State, or whether it was authoritarian leader in France or in England. You just can't do it. And so you need a representative government. Now, in England, sort of had a mixed government in the sense that they did have a House of Commons as well as a House of Lords and a king. But, of course, the problem was that the colonies didn't participate in any of that. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament. And so they were not represented in Parliament, and yet Parliament affirmed in the Declaratory Act of 1766 that they had full power over the colonies. And what the king made clear in 1775 with his speech from the throne in the fall was that he totally backed that he totally agreed that the British government, which he led, and of course, the House of Lords wasn't elected by anybody, and his government had total control over the colonies, and therefore he wasn't going to protect the liberties of the colonists. He was going to back the power of Parliament. And when that became clear, the idea of seeking relief from parliamentary authoritarianism was blown apart. And then you add to that the various perceived or actual atrocities committed by the British military, where there was the bombardment of Norfolk or the bombardment of Falmouth, and then later the atrocities after in New Jersey toward the end of 1776, or the atrocities with the soldiers captured at the Battle of Fort Washington in the summer of 1776. These events made it clear that the option for the American people, the only option if they wanted to protect their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, was independence under a Republican government.
I often get asked by my students when I say those things, when I talk about these self-evident truths and unalienable rights, what do those mean? Like, what does liberty mean for soon-to-be Americans? And I always try to explain this idea that a lot of Americans at the time, British subjects still, kind of had this budding American identity in a sense. They had this liberty already to a certain extent. They had political liberty through, their local assemblies, and the sheer fact that they paid the governor's salary through those. This idea that these guys, by paying the salary of their quote unquote boss, they have a say, they have some political liberties and economic liberties. Smuggling, navigation acts were ignored for the longest time, and smuggling allowed through West Indies a lot of these different goods to come in and go out. So it made a lot of people wealthy, but also created like social liberty in the sense that people could now afford goods that were not just British, which were expensive. They could afford other goods. So now you have this ability to, well, maybe I'm not wealthy, but maybe I'm this kind of middle class aspect. So I always try to argue that the colonists had this feeling of independence. And by getting that taste, when Britain steps in and says, no more, the idea of liberty is not something that's not concrete. No, they know what liberty means. They have an idea of what liberty means. So they want to preserve that. It's not something that's abstract.
I agree with your point that the colonists felt they had a degree of both fundamental political and economic liberty in the New World colonies. They, a lot of people who didn't have much opportunity or much political or economic opportunity in England had moved to the New World. And there they had made a success of themselves through their hard work, but also through the opportunity to be in a new expanding land. And they did not believe that, because they hadn't experienced it. England originally was trying to profit over the colonies, mostly by the colonies producing things that England needed that they couldn't produce in England, and by trade. What happened after the French and Indian War, after the English won with colonial help, because it was the colonial militias that did most of the fighting in the New World, after they beat France and got Canada. And Canada at that time, New France at that time, was not only what we think of as Quebec and Ontario, but actually went all the way down the Mississippi to Louisiana and claimed all the way basically to what's now Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania, the Ohio Valley. Well, the colonists wanted the British colonists in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the other colonies wanted to move into that area too. And the reason why they had liberty is because England had a tradition that only the government, it's still true. It was in the debates at the Supreme Court yesterday over the tariff, that only the people's elected representatives can impose a tax. And so Parliament, which the English colonists were not, the colonists in the New World were not represented by, could not impose a tax on the colonists. The only way the colonists' own legislatures, their own assemblies, the House of Burgesses in Virginia, they could impose taxes. And they did. They imposed taxes to fight the French and Indian War. They imposed taxes which were then contributed to the cost of the empire. They did impose taxes. And ultimately, the king had veto power over their legislation, but that was fine. They didn't mind that because they viewed they were subjects to the king. What happened was, after the French and Indian War, after Canada was captured, and that included the Ohio country and the Mississippi Valley, Parliament started imposing taxes directly to pay for the occupation of Canada, because Canada didn't want to be part of British. And so there were a lot of occupation costs to subdue the French people of Ontario and Canada and Quebec. And also dealing with the Native Americans, because there was a large Native American population in the Ohio Valley. And so to pay the cost of empire, they started directly taxing the American people. And that's where liberty comes in. That's where they first felt it. They realized it was more than that, but where they felt it, that's why the old phrase taxation without representation was representative of how they felt their liberty was being taken away. Because as James Otis wrote in his response to the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act of the mid-1760s, or Hopkins in Rhode Island, or Delaney in Maryland, or all these other key pamphlets, if you can take our property by imposing taxes on it without the consent of our elected representatives, you've taken all of our freedom. You've taken our pursuit of happiness. We are no better, and they always use this phrase, we are enslaved by Parliament, because they could take just a little now with the stamp tax or the sugar revenues. And the distinguishing of those is the Sugar Act and the various revenues they were adding were not imposed on the whole empire. So they weren't imposed on Dutch goods or Chinese goods coming into any place in the empire. And therefore, there was a sense of virtual representation because they'd have to be paid as well by the people in England. No, these were duties on things just coming into the colonies. So if they were coming from England into the colonists had to pay. Tariffs are taxes on people. They're not taxes on a foreign country. They're taxes on people. So something coming from England, there would be a tariff on it coming to Massachusetts. That would be like if Congress imposed a tariff on any goods going to Texas. Well, wait. The people of Texas, this is crazy. You can impose a tariff. Congress can impose a tariff on something coming in the United States, but not into just Texas. And that fundamentally took away their liberty. And then they doubled down. When the colonists resisted, they passed a declaratory act, and they said, we can make any laws we want on the colonists. Well, wait a minute. So the taxation, we think of it too narrowly when we think of it today as, oh, these selfish colonists, they wouldn't pay a little stamp tax, because it wasn't really that much. It was the idea that people, where they weren't representative, could impose little taxes or big taxes, take everything we have. That's our liberty. But they said they could put any restrictions they want on it. So that was, what is your pursuit of happiness? Well, certainly a big element of it is is prosperity. At the time when New Jersey declares its independence, they adopt a motto. And the motto is, liberty and prosperity. And I think that captures it even better than New Hampshire's live free or die, even though I personally love the phrasing live free or die. But it was capturing the same idea that liberty and prosperity go hand in hand. Then on top of that, they adopt the Quebec Act. So I think in so many ways, it's the Declaratory Act and the Quebec Act. Because what the Quebec Act does was the problem with the French in the Ohio country and what led to the French and Indian War, which becomes the 7 Years' War, was France was claiming the Ohio country and the area west of the Appalachian Mountains. And the key flashpoint was what is now Pittsburgh, western Pennsylvania, but that's where Fort Duquesne was. And the idea was the colonists believed that their freedom and their economic opportunity lie on the frontier. They thought about these things and they said, why are we different than the poor people in England? England was full, and so there was no opportunity. If your father was a butcher, you're going to become a butcher. If your father was basically tied to the land, working in a large manner, you're going to be tied to the land, working in a large manner. They didn't have slavery in England at all, but they had a very limited economic opportunity, where the Americans, a lot of these people with limited opportunity, they'd come over to America. And why could they get wealthy? Why could these people have opportunity? Why could they become middle class, or why could they become even wealthier than that? Like a Washington family or a Jefferson family, or ultimately Benjamin Franklin, who started out as an indentured servant. Because it was an opening country. They could move west. George Washington, who didn't think he was going to inherit Mount Vernon because it was going to go to his older brother, his future, he started investing. He became a surveyor and started investing and acquiring frontier land. So people thought it was because there was a frontier that there was economic opportunity. The Midland folks and the poorer folks could move west and gain their own land and through hard work, gain wealth and happiness. The wealthier people on the East Coast could invest in the frontier and get greater wealth through investing. So the war was fought over who controlled, and the original colonial documents all said, or mostly said, that the colonists went west to the Western Sea. So Virginia was extending westward. New York was extending westward, Connecticut, North Carolina, the Carolinas, they would, in theory, extend westward. Well, when they won through colonial participation, they won the French and Indian Wars, they thought, we got our frontier back. But then the British imposed the Quebec Act, limiting the extent of the colonies to the old borderline, the Appalachian Mountains, the old borderline with France, saying you can't move out there. We're going to preserve that area for the same thing the French were doing there, fur trading and Native Americans, and because there was wealth, the French Canadians were gaining wealth not through farming and opening farmland, but through fur trading, because there were excellent furs out in the Great Lakes regions, and trading with the Native Americans. And so suddenly, not only were the British imposing taxes on them, Virginians and people in Massachusetts, to pay for the occupation of Canada, but they were preventing the colonists from moving west. That's their whole idea of freedom. That's their whole economic and political and economic freedom went with the frontier. It was all mixed up in their heads. You can read it in the writings of Franklin or any of these people. So between the Declaratory Act and the actual taxation, and then the Declaratory Act and the Quebec Act, they had taken away their fundamental freedom, their pursuit of happiness, their possibility for increasing prosperity, their liberty. And so they were demanding to the king, no, those rights, our rights of Englishmen, are to be represented by our own and taxed by our own representatives. operating under you. You can veto the laws. You can be the role of a governor. But you've got to act, just as in England, you have to act through the parliament. You have to act through our colonial legislatures. Or Franklin said, or if you rather, you can give us representatives in parliament. Sort of like the French do today with all their former colonies around the world. They're represented in the French parliament. Give us representation in parliament. That'd be fine. We can be represented through parliament, or we can opt through our own assemblies. And when the king refused and kept all about England, which first became clear to the colonists when the speech of the throne reaches the colonies, which effectively reaches it in January of 1776, along almost simultaneously with news of the bombardment of Norfolk in Virginia and the release of Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It becomes electric. And that's, you can read Washington's letters from the siege of Boston, because he was leading the siege of Boston. He said, this is going to do it. This is finally going to convince people that we have no option.
It's as if the proclamation of 1763 was like the cherry on top. Land is now limited. You cannot go west.
And then the taxation without representation that begins with the Sugar Act the next year, and then the Stamp Act the following year, and then the Declaratory Act saying Parliament has full power in all things over the colonists in the following year. And then it just becomes a slide, the hope being always the king will limit this. And it finally becomes apparent in 1776 that the king was not on their side.
In what ways do you think this revolutionary spirit of that particular year, 1776, could maybe inform us or warn us against today's, you might say, threats to democratic institutions?
Reading these documents, reading the Declaration of Independence, reading the Adams' Thoughts on Government, reading Common Sense, which always bears reading and rereading, reading the state constitutions, which are absolutely formative. We don't give enough attention to the early state constitutions because they not only give a government structure, but they give a rationale and a purpose for it. And they often lead off with bills of rights, but they also lead off with the grievances of a king. So when we get frustrated with representative government, and we certainly do, I love the comment of Winston Churchill, famous comment about representative government, parliamentary government in his case, that it's the worst government in the world except any other. If you read these, it took them so long to finally, 10 years, to finally become convinced that they could never trust a monarch. They could never trust an authoritarian government. You might have an enlightened monarch for a while, but your faith has to go into, for all of its messiness, and certainly the representative governments, when they were new, of the colonists, had a messiness that we see, that ultimately are individual liberty, because their goal really wasn't independence. Their goal, becomes the mean. Their goal was not Republican government. That becomes their mean. Their goal, if you read all of these documents, their goal was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the American dream. And they become convinced that this can never come under authoritarian rule. Sure, there might be a communist state that works for a while, helps people for a while, but they become convinced that it takes written constitutions, which nobody had before, but every state adopts at that time. Written constitutions, rule of law, and Republican governments, for all their messiness, that is the hope, the ultimate hope for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
If you look at this revolutionary era history, or even early Republic history, can you think of any other year that might warrant its own book, just like you did with 1776? And maybe is that something you might consider down the line? That's
a good question. I wrote a book earlier about the election of 1800, where I follow an election over the course of the year, and you have other pivotal elections. And I do think that book was called A Magnificent Catastrophe, and it was about the contest between Adams and Jefferson. And I do think that contest was transformative of the American Republic. But there you're talking really about the election of that year. You have other elections that really were consequential. Obviously, I would think the election of 1860 when Lincoln was elected. There are books about 1865 when the war between the states ends and you get a new settlement. So there are other years that certainly matter. And in world history, you have years that matter as well. I think Solzhenitsyn wrote a famous book in 1914. It was a book about 1914, and 1914 was certainly a transformative year. 1939 with the coming of the Second World War. So there certainly are pivotal years, and it is often helpful to unpack those years. For me, before I was working on this book, I didn't know how much the idea of American independence, Republican government, rule of law were all tied up conveniently in a single calendar year, though they could spread over a period. So that was the one that attracted my attention. I can think of other years, but I haven't settled on one for myself because you've got to play with one's strength and one's skills. So I've got 1800 down with an election. This was really a revolution in thought.
And my last question, what do you read for fun? Find yourself reading fiction or nonfiction? Do you change between? And are you in the middle of any book right now, or have you read a book recently?
Well, I read different books. You're absolutely right. I love fiction. I read a lot of fiction. I read both current fiction and sort of classics. But I also like, needless to say, since I write nonfiction, I like good nonfiction, but I also like good travel stories. People who can really write good travel stories situated in other lands. Sometimes I even like science fiction. Of course, I love reading, whether it's comical as somebody like Doug Adams or serious. I think back of Arthur C. Clarke. There are people in different ways. We were just talking about Joseph Conrad. People can bring different insights in different ways. Historical fiction can be very informative. This was a year of where I had ended up giving a lot of talks on Clarence Darrow and the Scopes trial because it was the 100th anniversary. And, in some ways, Attorney for the Damned, which is historical fiction, does a wonderful job of capturing so well Clarence Darrow, maybe better than any of the historical biographies of it. Same way Aaron Burr, we were talking about the election of 1800. Am I working on that? In some way, Gore Vidal's historical fiction of him actually captures this elusive and bizarre character in American history, as Aaron Burr certainly was, better than a historian can try to capture him. So I try to jump around. But I guess if you really ask me, the collecting logic is I like good writing. I love to read good writing, whether it be a play or poetry or a novel or nonfiction. And I like to write. I like the art of writing. And I also like doing archival work. I like doing the research of a historian. I enjoy that, but it's sort of like two different parts of my brain. And my artistic outreach is crafting. There's some wonderfully factual books of history that bring a lot of research, but they're not really all that well written. And I like a good turn of phrase, and there's certain historians who can do that. James McPherson, for example, different historians who can do that. But they're also, you can't give up novels and plays. Because they too can really capture ideas and thoughts. I mean, reading Philip Roth, you can get so much a sense of the 50s through Philip Roth that you really can't get through reading a historian about the period.
So Ed, what are you working on now? I assume you are in the process of obviously doing talks about this book and appearances about this book, but are you already in the process of working on anything else?
Actually, I'm meeting with editors and talking about different projects, and somewhat I'm narrowing it down. I always have a few projects that I'm working on because some of them require more extensive archival work. We have to travel and do a lot of collecting of research. Other ones you can get now, a lot of the materials online. And so I have to sort of look ahead to my opportunities to do work to see what moves to the top. So since I don't know which one is actually going to be next, I'll wait till I know that. And then
reveal it.
Yeah.
Ed, thank you so much for joining me today. This truly was an honor and a pleasure, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on the expanding success of what you are doing. It's a tribute to your hard work and great insight and people skills.